The system of rural household industry remained typical of production in cloth, hardware, and other Western European goods until the introduction of factories in the late 18th century. It signified a new divergence between capital and labor. On the one hand were the workers, men and women who worked as the employer needed them, received wages for what they did, and had little interest in or knowledge of more than their own task. Living both by agriculture and by cottage industry, they formed an expansible labor force, available when labor was needed, left to live by farming or local charity when times were bad. On the other hand was the manager or entrepreneur, almost always a man, who directed the whole affair. He had little or no personal acquaintance with the workers. Estimating how 116 much of a product such as woolens he could sell in a national or even international market, he purchased the needed raw materials, passed out wool to be spun by one group of peasants, took the yarn to another group for weaving, collected the cloth, and took it still elsewhere to be dyed. Paying wages on all sides for services rendered, he retained ownership of the materials and the equipment and kept the coordination and management of the whole enterprise in his own head. Much larger business enterprises could be established in this way than within the municipal framework of guild and town. Indeed, the very master weavers of the guilds often sank to the status of subcontractors, hardly different from wage employees of the great clothiers and drapers by whom the business was dominated. The latter, with the widening market, became personages of national or even international repute. And of course, the bigger the business, the more of a capital investment it represented. Divergence between capital and labor. Certain other industries, new or virtually new in the 15th and 16th centuries, could by their nature never fit into a town centered system and were capitalistic from the start, in that they required a large initial outlay before any income could be received. Mining was one such 251 industry, and another was printing and the book trade. Books had a national and even international market, being mainly in Latin, and no ordinary craftsman could afford the outlay required for a printing press, for fonts of type, supplies of paper, and stocks of books on hand. Printers therefore borrowed from capitalists or shared with them an interest in business. Shipbuilding was so stimulated by the shift to transoceanic trade as almost to become a new industry, and still another was the manufacture of cannons and muskets. For the latter, the chief demand came from the state, from the new monarchies that were organizing national armies. In the rise of capitalism, the needs of the military were in fact fundamentally important. Armies, which started out by requiring thousands of weapons, required thousands of new uniforms, as well as many new barracks and fortifications throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. These heavy demands were the first to require mass production. Where governments themselves did not take the initiative, private middlemen stepped in as links to the many small handicraft workers and families who, before the industrial age, still manufactured the actual product. New industries. The new sea route to the east and the discovery of America brought a vast increase in trade, not only of luxury items, but of imported commodities like rice, sugar, tea, and other consumer goods. Older commercial activities within Europe were also transformed by the widening of markets. Spain increasingly drew cereals from Sicily. The Netherlands were fed from Poland. The French wine districts lived on food brought from northern France. With the growth of shipping, the timber, tar, pitch, and other naval stores of Russia and the Baltic entered the commercial scene. There was thus an ever growing movement of heavy staple commodities, in which again only persons controlling large funds of capital could normally take part. 252. Not all capital was invested. Some was simply lent to the church, to governments, to impecunious nobles, or to persons engaged in trade and commerce, though commercial loans were still the least common type of lending in the 16th century. Bankers and others who lent money expected to receive back, after a time, a larger sum than that of the loan. They expected interest, and they sometimes received as much as 30% a year. In the Middle Ages, the taking of interest had been frowned upon as usury, denounced as avarice, and forbidden in the canon law. It was still frowned upon in the 16th century by almost all but the lenders themselves. The Catholic Church maintained its prohibitions. 117. The theologians of the University of Paris also ruled against it in 1530. Luther, who hated bankers like the Fuggers, continued to preach against usury. Calvin made allowances, but as late as 1640, in capitalist Holland itself, the stricter Calvinist ministers still denounced lending at interest. New banking practices. The growing production of cloth in early modern Europe depended on the labor of families in rural cottage industries. Spinning thread became an important economic activity for many women, as Jean Bourdichamp, 1457 to 1521, demonstrates in this 253 illustration of a family at work. The man is apparently a skilled woodworker, and the child is gathering wood chips that can be used for cooking food or heating the house. The solid walls and ceiling show that this is a prosperous, hard-working family. Bridgman Giraudon, Art Resource. Religious interventions, however, could never stop the practice. Borrowers compounded with lenders to evade prohibitions, and theologians of all churches began to distinguish between usury and a legitimate return. Gradually, as interest rates fell, as banking became more established, and as loans were made for economically productive uses rather than to sustain ecclesiastics, princes, and nobles in their personal habits, the feeling against a reasonable interest died down, and interest became an accepted feature of capitalism. The Bank of Amsterdam, for example, attracted depositors because they knew their money was safe, would earn interest, and could be withdrawn at will. Deposits thus flowed into the bank from all countries and enabled it to make low interest loans that financed new commercial activities. The net effect of all these developments was a commercialization of industry. The dynamic entrepreneurial persons in commercial life were the merchants. Industry, the actual processes of production, still in an essentially handicraft stage, was subordinate to the buyers and sellers. Producers, spinners, weavers, hatters, metalworkers, gunsmiths, glass workers, worked to fill the orders of the merchants, and often with capital that the 118 merchants supplied and owned. The entrepreneur who knew where the article could be sold prevailed over the person who simply knew how to produce it. This commercial capitalism remained the typical form of capitalism until after 1800, when, with the introduction of power machinery, it yielded to industrial capitalism, and merchants became dependent on industrialists who owned, understood, and organized the machines. Merc. In both countries, the government assisted merchants who wished to set up domestic or cottage industry in the country against the protests of the town guilds, which in their heyday had forbidden rural people to engage in crafts. Governments generally tried to suppress idleness. The famous English Poor Law of 1601, which remained in effect with amendments until 1834, was designed to force able-bodied people to work and to relieve the absolute destitution of those who could not. Opposition to guilds. Governments likewise took steps to introduce new industries. The silk industry was brought from Italy to France under royal protection, to the dismay of French woolen and linen interests. The English government assisted in turning England from a producer of 119 raw wool into a producer of finished woolens, supervising the immigration of skilled Flemish weavers, and even fetching from faraway Turkey, about 1582, two youths who understood the more advanced dyeing arts of the Middle East. Generally, under mercantilism, governments fought to steal skilled workers from each other while prohibiting or discouraging the emigration of their own skilled workers, who might take their trade secrets to foreign places. By such means, governments helped to create a national market and an industrious nationwide labor supply for their great merchants. Without such government support and government-imposed tariffs, the great merchants, such as the drapers or clothiers, could never have risen and prospered. The same help was given to merchants operating in foreign markets. Henry VII of England, for example, negotiated a commercial treaty with Flanders in 1496. And in the next century, the kings of France signed treaties with the Ottoman Empire by which French merchants obtained privileges in the Middle East. A merchant backed by a national monarchy was in a much stronger position than one backed merely by a city, such as Augsburg or Venice. This backing on a national scale was 256 also provided when national governments subsidized exports, paying bounties for goods whose production they wished to encourage. or when they erected tariff barriers against imports to protect their own producers from competition. National markets. A national tariff system was thus superimposed on the old network of provincial and municipal tariffs. These latter were now thought of as internal tariffs, which mercantilists usually wished to abolish by creating an area of free trade within the state as a whole. But local interests were so strong that for centuries the European monarchies were unable to get rid of local tariffs except in England. Meanwhile, however, the new commercial capitalism developed everywhere with the support of government protections, subsidies, and economic interventions. In distant parts of the world, or in less accessible regions nearer home, such as the Middle Eastern Muslim lands or Russia, it was not possible for individual European merchants to act by merely private initiative. Merchants trading with such countries needed a good deal of capital. They often had to obtain special privileges and protection from native rulers, and they had to arm their ships against Barbary or Malay pirates or against hostile Europeans. Merchants and their respective governments came together to found official companies for the transocean trade. In England, soon after the English discovery of the White Sea in 1553, a Russia company was established. A Turkey company soon followed. Shortly after 1600, a great many such companies were operating out of England, Holland, and France. The most famous of all were the East India Companies, which the English founded in 1600, the Dutch in 1602, the French not until 1664. In 1672, the English also chartered the Royal African Company, which for a time controlled the English slave trade and the gold imports from West Africa. Each of these companies was a state supported organization with special rights. Each was a monopoly in that only merchants who belonged to the company could legally engage in trade in the region for which the company had a charter. Each was 257 expected to find markets for the national products, and most of them were expected to bring home gold or silver. With these companies, the Northern European peoples began to encroach on the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly in America, Africa, and the East. With them, new commercial colonial empires would be launched and expanded after various domestic and transnational European conflicts were settled in outcomes that strengthened the northwestern European states. Chartered trading companies, 120. The headquarters of the Dutch East India Company in Bengal in 1665, long before the British gained predominance there. It is wholly walled off from the Indian life around it, with offices, living quarters, and spacious gardens for employees of the company. Universal History Archive, Getty Images. 13. Changing social structures. Social structure, for present purposes, refers to the composition, functions, and interrelationships of social classes. Because changes in social structure are slow, they are hard to identify in specific decades or particular periods of time. In general, however, with the effects of the commercial revolution, population growth, and the falling value of 258 money, the classes of Europe, broadly defined, took on forms that were to last until the industrializing era of the 19th and 20th centuries. These classes were the landed aristocracy, the peasantry or mass of agricultural workers, the miscellaneous middle classes, and the urban poor. While all prices rose in the 16th century, it was agricultural prices that rose the most. Anyone who had agricultural products to sell was likely to benefit. Among such beneficiaries were peasants who held small plots of land in return for fixed payments to a manorial lord. Many such payments were set in unchangeable sums of money, in the old values of the 14th or even 13th century, so the price inflation of the 16th century enabled some peasants in effect to pay much less to the lord than in the past. Other rural workers, however, either held no land of their own or produced only at a subsistence level with nothing to sell in the market. Such peasants and hired hands dependent on wages found their situation worsened. Village life became less egalitarian than it had been in the Middle Ages. In England, a class of small freeholders, the yeomanry, developed between the landed gentry and the rural poor. On the continent, at least in France, Western Germany, and the Netherlands, an increasingly prosperous class of peasants acquired more secure property rights, resembling those of small freeholders in England. But both in England 121 and on the continent, a large class of unpropertied rural workers remained in poverty and excluded from the emerging international markets for agricultural products. Small freeholders. Land rents in the countryside went up as rising agricultural prices increased the value of arable soil. Inflation and population growth also drove up rentals for housing in the more crowded towns. Owners of real property, that is, land and buildings, were favored by such changes, but within the former class of feudal lords, the effects were mixed. If one's 259 great grandfather had let out land in earlier times in exchange for fixed sums of money, the value of the income received from that land had actually declined. But those landowners who received payments in kind from their tenants, for example, in bushels of wheat or barley, or who managed their large estates themselves, could sell more wealthy. In either case, and even if they served as military commanders, they became more concerned with civilian pursuits, and they were likely to develop more refined tastes and pay more attention to the education of their children. Like the peasants, the landowning class became more heterogeneous, ranging from the small gentry to the great peers of England, and from small or impoverished nobles to the grand seigneurs of France. Some led a life of leisure. Others were eager to work in the higher reaches of organized government. The most impoverished nobles sometimes had the longest pedigrees. As their social functions changed, and as persons of more recent family background competed for education, government employment, and even military service, there came to be an increasing importance set upon ancestry as a badge of status. Among the upper class, there was more insistence on high birth and distinguished forebears in the 17th and 18th centuries than there had been before. But many nobles also claimed that they deserved special privileges because they contributed meritorious service to kings or the expanding national governments. The nobility 260 below the aristocracy were the middle classes, or bourgeoisie. Bourgeois was a French word, which, like the English burgher, originally meant a person living in a chartered town or borough and enjoying its liberties. The bourgeoisie was the whole social class made up of individual bourgeois. In a much later sense of the word, derived from Karl Marx in the 19th century, the term bourgeoisie was applied to the class of owners of capital. This Marxist concept of the bourgeoisie must be kept distinct from the meaning of the word in an earlier era. Bourgeoisie referred in pre-industrial times to the middle levels of society between the aristocracy, which mostly drew its income from land, and the laboring poor, who depended on wages or charity, or who often went hungry. Class lines tended to blur as aristocratic families formed the habit of living in towns and middle-class burghers began to buy land in the country. Some bourgeois thus came to live on landed rents, while some of the gentry and aristocracy, most notably in England, bought shares in the great overseas trading companies or engaged in other forms of business enterprise. Aristocrats possessing large agricultural estates, timberlands, or mines increasingly brought their products to market to be sold at a profit. But even when 1 in 22 aristocrat and bourgeois became economically more alike, a consciousness of social difference between them remained. The bourgeoisie. The middle class became more numerous in the 16th century, and increasingly so thereafter. It was an indefinite category because the countries of Europe differed in the size and importance of their middle classes, in the kinds of persons who belonged to them, and in the types of occupations that bourgeois people pursued. Near the top were the urban elites who governed the towns. They might draw their incomes from rural property, from commerce, or from the emoluments of government itself, and they sometimes intermarried with persons of noble status. Especially where the towns were strong or royal government was weak, as in the 261 Netherlands, the German Free Cities, or North Italy, such urban patriciates formed virtual aristocracies in themselves. But in a larger social perspective, or in the context of the more powerful monarchical states, the families of merchants, bankers, and ship owners were middle class, as were those of the traditional learned professions, law and medicine. So, in general, were judges, tax officials, and other employees of governments, except in the highest ranks. In the professions and in government service, the younger sons of the aristocracy might be found alongside the offspring of the middle classes. most commonly in England, less so in France, and even less as one moved into Germany or Spain. Middle class growth and diversity, the clergy was drawn from all classes. There were poor parish priests who might be the sons of peasants, and there were bishops and abbots from the most prominent noble families. But the bulk of the clergy was recruited from middle class families. In Protestant countries, where the clergy married, their sons and daughters became an important element in the middle class. Members of trade guilds were middle class, though the guilds differed widely in social status, from those of the great wholesale merchants or the goldsmiths, down through the guilds of such humble occupations as the tanners and barrel makers. At the bottom of bourgeois social life, the middle class faded into the socio-economic world of small retail shopkeepers, innkeepers, owners of workshops in which ordinary articles were manufactured by hand, the lesser skilled tradespeople, and their employees, journeymen and apprentices. The mass of the population in all countries was composed of the working poor. These included not only the unskilled wage laborers, but the unemployed, unemployable, and paupers, with a large fringe that turned to vagabondage and begging. They were unable to read or write and were often given to irregular habits that distressed both middle class persons and government officials. Poverty was increasingly viewed as an example or outcome of immorality. Mercantilist governments tried to make poor people work, but charitable relief also developed toward the end of the 262 16th century, as shown in the English Poor Law of 1601 and in similar efforts on the continent. The idea gained ground that begging was a public nuisance and that the poor should thus be segregated in workhouses or hospices from the rest of society. Most of the poor were, of course, not recipients of such relief, and most did hard work. They were the working men and women who tilled the fields, wove the cloth, tended the livestock, dug in the mines, or went to sea as fishermen and common sailors. They also found work in the towns as casual laborers, porters, water carriers, or removers of excrement. Or they entered the domestic service of noble and upper middle class families, whose rising standard of living required a growing number of chambermaids, cooks, washerwomen, footmen, lackeys, coachmen, and stable boys. Domestic service was in fact the most common job for women during the entire period of early modern history, and the pay for such work remained extremely low. Wages rose less than prices in the 16th century. The poor, if not positively worse off than in former times, gained the least from the great commercial developments with which economic history is usually concerned. The very growth of social differentiation, the fact that the middle and upper classes made such advances, left the condition of the poor correspondingly worse. The Working Class Poor. 263 Peasants at Lunch by Diego Velázquez, Spanish, 1599 to 1660. Velázquez was best known for his portraits of people at the Spanish royal court, but he also portrayed the lives and character of the lower classes, as in this detail from a 17th century painting of peasants sharing food at a table. Imagno, Getty Images. 124 Social Roles of Education and Government. Education in the latter part of the 16th century took on an altogether new importance for the social system. One consequence of the Reformation in both Protestant and Catholic countries was the attempt to put a serious and effective pastor in each parish. This set up a demand for a more educated clergy. The growth of commerce made it necessary to have literate clerks and agents. Governments wanted men from both the 264 noble and middle classes who could cooperate in large organizations, be reliable, understand finance, keep records, and draft proposals. There was also a widespread need for lawyers. Every profession, commercial enterprise, and government institution, in short, was seeking better educated persons to manage and advance their interests. The new demand for education was met by an outburst of philanthropy, which reached a high point in both England and France between about 1580 and 1640. Many endowed scholarships were established. At what would now be called a secondary level, hundreds of grammar schools were founded at this time in England. In France, the colleges combined the work of the English grammar school with what corresponded to the first year or two of university work at Oxford or Cambridge. Of the 167 most important French colleges still existing at the time of the Revolution in 1789, only 36 had been founded in the centuries before 1560, and 92 were established in the years between 1560 and 1650. Provision for girls' schools was more sporadic, but the Ursuline sisters, for example, founded in Italy in 1535, had established about 350 convents by the year 1700 in Catholic Europe and even in Canada, in most of which the education of girls was a principal purpose and occupation of the sisters. New schools and universities. Dutch and Swiss Protestants founded the universities of Leiden and Geneva. New universities, both Protestant and Catholic, appeared in Germany. In Spain, the multiplication of universities was phenomenal. Castile, with only 2 universities dating from the Middle Ages, had 20 by the early 17th century. Salamanca was enrolling over 5,000 students a year. 5 universities also existed in Spanish America by 1600. In England, new colleges were founded at Oxford and Cambridge, and it was especially in these years that some of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges became very wealthy. Annual admissions of new students at Oxford, barely 100 in 1550, rose to over 500 in the 1630s, a figure not exceeded or even equaled during the following 200 years. 265, the schools, colleges, and universities drew their students from a wide range of social classes. There was less organized schooling for girls than for boys, but an intelligent and lucky boy of poor family had perhaps a better chance for education than at any time in Europe until the later 20th century. In Spain, most of the students seem to have been lesser nobles or hidalgos, aspiring to positions in the church or government, but hidalgos were very numerous in Spain, overlapping with what might be called the middle class in other countries. The French colleges, including those operated by the Jesuits, recruited their students very widely, taking in the sons of nobles, merchants, shopkeepers, artisans, and even, more rarely, of peasants. English grammar schools did likewise. It was in later times that a few of them, like Eton and Harrow, became more exclusive public schools. As for universities, we have detailed knowledge for Oxford, which recorded the status of its 125 students at matriculation, classifying them as esquires, gentlemen, clergy, and plebeians. From 1560 to 1660, about half of the Oxford students were plebeians, which in the language of that time could embrace the whole middle class, from big merchants down to quite modest social levels. It seems certain that Oxford and Cambridge were more widely representative of the English people in 1660 than in 1900. Wider access to education. 266a, 17th century monk, is teaching in Spain at the University of Salamanca, one of the largest European universities of the time, and an example of how such institutions expanded in both Catholic and Protestant countries during the century after the Protestant Reformation. Many students are more interested in their friends or other distractions than in the instructor's lecture, which suggests the continuities of classroom experiences across the centuries. DEA Gigli Orti, Getty Images. Social classes were formed not only by economic forces and not only by education, but also by the actions of governments. We have noted how kings contributed to the rise of commercial capitalism and a new business class by granting monopolies, borrowing from bankers, and issuing charters to trading companies. In many countries, and notably in France, many families owed their middle class position to the holding of government offices, some of which might become a form of inheritable property. It might also be the action of governments, as much as economic conditions, that defined or promoted distinctions between nobles and commoners, or privileged and unprivileged social classes. Where peasants suffered heavily from royal taxes, it was more from political than from economic causes. The king, by making nobles, that is, by conferring titles of nobility on persons who did not inherit them, could raise a few in the middle class to higher status. Tax exemption could also be a sign of high social standing. The king exercised political power, but he was simultaneously the fountain of social honor at the top of 267 society. The royal court formed the apex of a pyramid of social rank in which each class looked up to or down upon the others. Those favored with the royal presence disdained the plain country nobility, who sniffed at the middle classes, who patronized or disparaged the hired 126 servants, day laborers, and the poor. Looking upward in the social hierarchy, people were expected to show deference toward those with higher social status. Government and social classes, Eastern and Western Europe. One other remark may be made on social structure. It was in the 16th century that important social differences developed between Eastern and Western Europe. In the West, the commercial revolution and the gradual emergence of global trading systems brought advantageous changes to the middle class and even to many of the peasants, for whom the old burdens of the manorial system were lightened. In Eastern Europe, it was the lords who benefited from rising prices and the growing market for grain and forest products. Here, too, the institution of the manor existed. But the peasants' land tenures were more precarious than in the West and more dependent on accidents of death or on the wishes of the lord. The lords in Eastern Europe also tended to work a larger part of their manors with their own workforces for their own use or profit. The rise of prices and expansion of Baltic shipping gave the lords a strong incentive to increase their output. In northeast Germany, where such lords were called Junkers, in Poland, and later in Russia, Bohemia, and Hungary, beginning in the 16th century and continuing into the 18th, a vast process set in by which most of the peasantry sank into more restrictive forms of serfdom. This process was hastened in many regions by the violence and insecurity engendered by the religious wars. Typically, peasants lost their individual parcels of land or received them back on the condition that they render unpaid labor services to the lord. 268. Usually, peasants owed 3 or 4 days a week of such forced labor, called robot in Bohemia and adjoining territories, remaining free to work during the remainder of the week on their own parcels. Often, the number of days of robot exacted by the lord was greater, since in Eastern Europe, where centralized legal systems were almost unknown, the lord himself was the final court of appeal for his people. His people were, in fact, his subjects. Serfdom in Eastern Europe. Serfdom in Germany was not called serfdom, but hereditary subjection. By whatever name they were known throughout Eastern Europe, serfs, or hereditary subjects of the manorial lord, could not leave the manor, marry, or learn a trade without the lord's express permission. Lords used this compulsory labor mainly for agriculture, though some serfs learned handicrafts that were needed on the estate. The large property owners sold the estate's produce, however, and retained the profits for themselves. Thus, in Eastern Europe at the beginning of modern times, the rural masses lost personal freedoms and lived in a poverty that was mostly unknown among the peasants to the west, poor as the latter were. In Western Europe, there were peasants who were already on the way to becoming small proprietors. They were free people under the law. They could migrate, marry, and learn trades as opportunity offered. Those who held land could defend it in the royal courts and raise crops and take part in the market economy on their own account. They owed the lord no forced labor, or virtually none, for the 10 days a year of forced labor, called the corvée, still found in parts of France, hardly compared with the almost full-time robot of the peasant in Eastern Europe. The landlord in the East, from the 16th century onward, was solidly entrenched in his own domain, monarch of all he surveyed, with no troublesome urban bourgeoisie to annoy him, and with kings and territorial rulers solicitous of his wishes. Travelers from the West were 269 impressed with the wealth of great Polish and Lithuanian magnates, with their palatial homes, private art galleries, well-stocked libraries, collections of jewels, 127 gargantuan dinners, and lavish hospitality. The Junkers of Northeast Germany lived more modestly, but enjoyed the same kind of independence and social superiority. The growing power of wealthy landlords and the weakening position of impoverished peasants would have decisive social and political consequences for the later history of Prussia, Poland, Russia, and the Austrian world. But meanwhile, amidst all the economic growth, social development, and overseas conquests that have been described in the preceding pages, Europe was torn by the destructive ferocity of the wars of religion.